Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's virtual event, Sempre, Libera, Finding Freedom and Feminism in La Traviata. My name is Alyssa Greenberg, and I'm the Community Engagement Director at Toledo Opera. We have convened a very exciting and dynamic group of feminist artists, scholars, and Toledo community members to explore some against-the-grain interpretations of La Traviata ahead of Toledo Opera's production next week on Friday, April 22nd and Sunday, April 24th at the Valentine Theater in downtown Toledo. Before we go any further, we wish to thank our generous supporters, Ohio Humanities, Key Bank, and the Wolf Family Charitable Foundation. At Toledo Opera, we take every opportunity to share the magic of opera with you at our events. This evening, we will present soprano Catherine Lewick singing Sempre Libera for a recent Metropolitan Opera Guild luncheon, accompanied by pianist Greg Ketter. Catherine Lewick will be debuting the role of Violetta in our upcoming production of La Traviata. She has established herself as one of opera's most thrilling coloratura sopranos of this generation. She has performed some of the most vocally challenging roles in the repertoire, joining the top-ranking operatic performers of all time. After the performance, the next face you will see will be Dr. Angela Fitzpatrick, director of the Catherine S. Eberly Center for Women at the University of Toledo, who will be our moderator this evening. Her doctoral dissertation, Women of Ill Fame, Discourses of Prostitution and the American Dream in California, 1850 to 1890, examines sex work in the 19th century. She will introduce you tonight to this evening's panelists. Thank you to our moderator and panelists for joining us tonight, and to all of you for being here. We hope you will jump into the chat and share your thoughts, comments, and questions with your fellow audience members. And now, enjoy the performance and the panel.
Gioia in gioia, oh che scorra viver mio bei sentieri del piacer. Nasca io giorno, giorno muoia, sempre lieta nei diletti sempre nuovi devo volare il mio pensier. Devo volare il mio pensier. Il pensier
What a beautiful performance. Oh my goodness. Great way to get us started. I'm Angie Fitzpatrick, director of the Eberly Center for Women, and I'll be the moderator for tonight. Please do drop your thoughts or your questions in the comments. The panelists and I are really looking forward to having a discussion, not just with each other, but also with all of you in attendance. So I'm going to do some quick introductions of our panelists, and then we'll jump into the discussion. All right, so first up we have Dr. Naomi Andre. She's a professor in the Department of Afro-American and Africana Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Residential College at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on opera and issues surrounding gender, voice, and race in the US, Europe, and South Africa. Her publications include topics on Italian opera, Schoenberg, women composers, and teaching opera in prisons. Dr. Andre's book, Black Opera, History, Power, Engagement, won the Lowens Book Award from the Society for American Music and the Judy Sau Critical Race Studies Award from the American Musicological Society. We're excited to have you with us, Naomi. All right, and then next up we have Dr. Jennifer Creswell. She is a soprano, librettist, published poet, and author with a passion for curating and creating art through a 21st century lens. A thought leader on women in art, she has also presented twice at the National Opera Association and recently appeared on Keturah Stichan's podcast Words First, as well as Opera Uprising, where she speaks candidly about what it means to be a singer, creator, and mother in today's artistic market. Dr. Creswell is also the co-founder of GDQ Arts, a nonprofit arts organization focused on elevating women's stories through spoken and sung theater. Then we have, finally, and I'm sorry, is there a lag with my video? It seems to be lagging on my end. No? Technology, right? When it works, it's great. When it doesn't. I'm going to stop my camera and see if that helps. Okay, so finally we have Sarah Jobin, one of the most experienced female American opera conductors working today. Jobin broke the glass podium at San Francisco Opera, Arizona Opera, and Baltimore Lyric Opera. Admittedly fed up with opera plots where women so often die to sustain the patriarchy, Jobin found a niche in contemporary opera early on, championing contemporary American works from Anchorage to Avignon, and then from all these other places whose names I cannot pronounce. For a decade, she served as principal conductor for the Center for Contemporary Opera in New York and is now music director emerita. So, fantastic group of panelists tonight. Real quick, is the sound better now that my camera's off? Is it not cutting out? Okay, excellent. So I'll just keep my camera off.
I like to see your face too.
Yes, but if it's choppy sound, then that's not so great. Okay, so Naomi, why don't you kick us off with an overview of the plot?
Sure. What a pleasure. And thank you so much for that warm introduction, getting us going. And oh my gosh, what an incredible sound. I'm going to spend just a couple of moments that's going to provide a quick overview and plot context for Verdi's La Traviata. The opera was written and performed in 1853, and it was a collaboration between Verdi and one of his most frequent librettists, Francesco Maria Piave. And this was for the leading theater in Venice, La Fenice, translates to the Phoenix, because at various points the opera house sort of was burned and then arose out of the ashes. This happened in the late 17th century, and it happened again in 1996. Francesco Maria Piave was the Il Poeta, who was connected with La Fenice, and Verdi's first opera outside of Milan, Ernani, in 1844, as well as Macbeth, was a collaboration with Piave. Macbeth was for La Pergola in Florence, and then La Forza del Destino. But they collaborated a lot. Traviata was in there. The opera, in terms of Verdi's output, it's considered part of his middle trilogy. So we think of Verdi's 26 or 28 operas, depending how you count revisions, as sort of falling in the early period, a bunch of operas in the 40s, his middle period in the 50s, and then the later period from 60s, Forza del Destino, Aida in 71, Otello in 87, and Falstaff in 93. The middle trilogy are well-known operas from 1851 to 53, Rigoletto, Trovatore, and La Traviata. And these represent sort of what makes the middle, late, and all. So the earlier operas from the 40s were more coming out of a primo Ottocento style. So a style that is commiserate, similar to Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti. And then moving into the 50s, of which Traviata is part of, we have Verdi really developing, knowing all the forms and the style, but having a more mature and experienced style. What this means, and this is from the 50s on through his last opera, Falstaff, in 93, sorry. What makes these lates different? So there were certain formulas that we have for arias and scenes, and so he knows those and he's stretching those, changing them, adding more depth to them. He's writing with a denser orchestral style, and his characters, which is definitely going to be relevant to us, are more psychologically complex. The opera is based on a novel by Alexandre Dumas Fils. His father was also a novelist, and he's born. The son was lived from 1824 to 95, so he's directly contemporaneous with Verdi, who was born in 1813, 9 years earlier, or 11 years earlier, and Verdi died in 1901. Dumas died in 95. La Dame aux Camellias, The Lady of the Camellia Flowers, the novel was published in 1848. It was then adapted by Dumas for the stage as a play in February of 1852. Verdi saw this play in Paris, really enjoyed it, fell in love with it, and decided to set it as an opera. It's thought that he saw it with a woman who was his wife at that time, or no, actually was going to become his wife, Giuseppina Stopponi, and she was Italian and had moved to Paris, and Verdi and Giuseppina would go to Paris a lot and watch things. So the story of an unmarried woman, a singer, with Verdi is sort of one of the little backgrounds to this. The play was also really current, not just in terms of when it was written, but being about the situation of a young woman and young women who were kept and sort of bought for sexual favors, becoming sort of a demi-monde, a courtesan. Marguerite Gautier in the novel La Dame aux Camellias is based on a real character, real person, Marie Duplessis, and she became a courtesan at the age of 16. In fact, she was a hostess of a popular salon in Paris, and she died of tuberculosis at the age of 23. So in terms of how the plot works, we've got this background, not just the novel and the play, but also the real person who was involved with the author, Alexandre Dumas Fils. Okay, let me talk really quickly about the plot. The plot of La Traviata is divided into 3 acts, and Act 2 is broken into 2 scenes. In Act 1, we meet Violetta. She's throwing a party. She is part of this courtesan culture. She'd been sick before, but this is sort of her coming out. She's been sick from consumption, which is now later in the 19th century that was discovered to be and called tuberculosis. She meets Alfredo at the party. He declares his love for her. He's heard of her. She demurs, but then together they sing this wonderful drinking song. Yeah, I know, kind of odd, but this Libiamo, we're all really happy with it. After the party is over, so he sort of declares his love for her at a moment when all the crowds are staying, sort of moving from one room to another. He stops and tells her that he loves her. After the party, and she sort of blows him off. After the party, though, we have this wonderful moment when she's at home and she sings what was common at that time, sort of a double aria. She sings a slow section where she says, maybe it's him. Maybe I could find love. She interrupts herself and says, folia, craziness. And then she moves into this fast, rousing number, the cabaletta, which is called Sempre, Libera, always free. I am not going to go with this guy. I am always going to be independent. However, and we heard the Sempre, Libera, the cabaletta, though it wasn't in the orchestra, a beautiful piano, there was a moment where there was a tune from the slower part of the aria, and with the double aria, the first slow part. And it will certainly make sense when you go see it in the house, because you will have just heard the both parts. And so you wonder, when she was sort of trying to decide, do I love him? Do I not? And she basically, with that wonderful bravura, with all the high notes and the fioritura, the fast section, she says, no, I'm always free. Act 2, scene 1 opens. It's 3 months later, and we find out that Violetta has chosen love, and that she's staying in the country outside of Paris, where the rest of the action has taken place. And we find out that she is home with Alfredo, sort of setting up a home that she is financing. When the nurse tells, or Anina, who is Violetta's sort of maid, friend, sort of the person who she's hired to help her, she tells Alfredo, actually, this money is coming from Violetta. Alfredo's like, oh my goodness, I'm going to go and try to get some money, because Alfredo comes from a higher class family. When Alfredo's gone, his father, Germont, he's known as, though that's sort of their last name, but Germont comes and he says to Violetta, you must leave Alfredo. And there's a very intense duet. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in the second act, this first scene, there's an intense duet where Germont convinces Violetta, okay, I have to leave Alfredo. Act 2, scene 2, the second part, takes place just a little bit later, and like a few weeks later, and we are back in Paris, and we're at another party. This is Flora's party, and we met Flora because she was a friend of Violetta for Violetta's party in Act 1. Now we're going to, Flora is a courtesan. We go to another party, and we have all this wonderful entertainment. There's some people who are performing. We see Violetta there, and she's with the Baron, the person she had been with in the first act. Alfredo sees her, is very upset because he doesn't know that his father had told Violetta she has to leave. And so he makes a big scene. And he embarrasses himself, but he also really insults Violetta. A few months, and that's the end of Act 2. So Act 2, the father actually says to his son, you've really behaved badly. I'm a little embarrassed by you. But Alfredo is all like, there's that woman who said she loved me, but now she's not with me. So Violetta is seen as this sort of wayward woman by Alfredo. Act 3, a few months later, Violetta, remember she was sick before the opera? She's sadly now sick and dying. She's alone, and the doctor comes in, and he pretty much confirms this, though he doesn't tell Violetta this. He kind of pretends she's okay. And just as we think everything is lost, Alfredo and his father show up. And it turns out that Germont, the father, has told Alfredo, actually, Violetta's really sick and she didn't want to leave you. And it was me who made her leave you. And so he rushes in, both the father and the son. But Alfredo says, I love you. Let's start a new life. She says, okay, yep, that sounds great. We think everything is fine. And then sadly, she collapses. Sorry, the spoiler alert, she dies. So we have this woman at the center of the story, Violetta. We see her from other men's view, and yet there's a side of her that we see as this is beginning Verdi's middle period, and we're beginning to see a little more complexity and depth in her character. But I will stop that for our interpretation, and that basically takes us through the plot.
Thank you so much for that, Naomi. This is an opera that has had its fair share of criticism, right? It's both beloved and also one that has, again, been criticized from folks over the decades, over the ages. So Dr.
Absolutely.
Cresswell, do you want to talk to us a little bit about your interpretation and also give us some insight into what, into the person that this opera was based on?
Sure, I would be happy to. Welcome, everyone. I think this is my first time talking. So I think that it's important always to see and to recognize who is telling the story. And although like a more complex soprano role is always welcomed, I'm glad Verdi made that journey. The truth is that La Traviata is still the story being told by, by Piave and also by Verdi. They were in their early 40s when they wrote this. And they're writing a very romanticized, glamorous take about a trope that we know really well in entertainment, right? The hooker with a heart of gold. It's the redemptive quality that allows people to still be attracted to a sex worker. And they still feel their morals are intact when that happens, right? Because she's such a good person. So I think that one thing that is really interesting is that the person who wrote the novel, right, Dumas fils, did have a love affair with this woman born Alphonsine Plessis, who later changed her name to Marie and then many other names. But they were both 20 years old when they met. They were the same age. And she was already showing signs of early tuberculosis. She actually had, there are documented things that talk about her showing signs for the last 4 years of her life, at least. This woman's life is extremely tragic. The person that Traviata is based on. There was a lot of child abuse. She was from a small town. Her mother was from a more noble family than her father. Her mother was said to be devastatingly beautiful, much like her daughter, her younger daughter. But the abuse was so awful that she abandoned her 2 children, the mother did, when Alphonsine was 8 years old. And the father was a raging alcoholic, clearly has some issues with women. His mother was actually the local town prostitute, and his father, he was the illegitimate child of a priest. His mother had the nickname in town as the Hag. And so this is the family that Alphonsine Plessis was born into. Her mother abandoned her when she was 8 years old. Her older sister got to go work with a family that was like 16 years old. So she did very well. But Alphonsine was catered and shuffled around. At the age of 12, she was working. And that's when her father started taking her and dropping her off at a man in his 70s house and leaving her for the weekend. And she would return with 20 francs. And he was selling her when she was 12 years old because she could make more money for the family that way. He did eventually leave her when she was 14 years old in Paris. But there are a lot of stories. The rumor is that there were tales of incest happening and that the town was after him and he had served some jail time. So that is when he dropped her off with distant relatives of her mother in Paris. She did not start out in Paris as a sex worker. She was working and she did that for a solid year until she realized that even as a peasant with a thick accent, her beauty was such that she had a shot at living a good material life because of the many men, some double, triple, quadruple her age, were willing to pay for her body. And it is about 3 years after that that she arrived at the height of the demi-monde world. So that's the person that the novel and the play and then the opera is based on. And I think that it's really important to think about what her words that Piave and Verdi gave her might mean when she's singing her aria, Sempre, Libera, right? And the mentality that goes into a childhood like that and what might feel like freedom and also what is on her terms and what is not. I'm going to step out right there.
These are excellent points, because what is freedom? What does freedom look for us like today? What does it look like for that woman over 100 years ago, where gender and class and sort of family upbringing, oh my gosh, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Creswell. Kim says, wow, horrific history, but fascinating that she rose to some influence in power. And yes, she is very much portrayed as a woman of influence and power. But again, as you said, to what extent, right? What were the constraints placed on her within her sphere of influence and power? And so, this is my first opera ever. And but not my first story of a hooker with a heart of gold.
Welcome.
Thank you. I thought it was absolutely beautiful, and watching this performance again of Sempre, Libera makes me really want to go and see it when it's here in town. So I will be going. But I also laughed when I started watching this, and I laughed at this idea that Alfredo is so remarkable, so handsome, so romantic, that he doesn't have to pay for this, prostitute. She is just going to give him her love and her time and her attention, right? And in fact, she's going to give up her life of pleasure and go live with him in the country. And this, to me, is yet another patriarchal fantasy, right? It's the kind that we hear from, dudes at the restaurant who think the flirtatious waitress is really into them, right? She's not just trying to get an extra $5. So, I laughed a little bit at that. And then also, as you pointed out, Dr. Creswell, she embodies this hooker with a heart of gold. And there are also these other stereotypes that come up, right? She's the happy hooker who lives for pleasure, right? Like, this is the life that she wants to have. She represents a whore to Alfredo's virginal sister, right? His sister couldn't marry because her brother was, shacking up with a woman of ill fame. And she's also the soiled dove who dies destitute, right? The fallen woman. And she's almost alone, but Alfredo comes to her in that final moment. So, the other thing that made me laugh a little bit is thinking about all these different stereotypes that are present in the opera, and just how they ignore the real complex and nuanced lives of women who were in the sex industry in the 19th century, right? It wasn't something that was, it was not a carefree life, right? There were probably moments when, for a courtesan, things were good, but there was also, violence and economic exploitation. And those things get, washed away, right, in this beautiful romantic tale. And I think too of, so I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, well, who are the people that really would have been into this opera, right? Who would have been watching this? Was this just for rich men who wanted a courtesan of their own? Was it for their wives who were sitting next to them, and the wives can feel okay about perhaps looking the other way if their husbands were in fact going to courtesans? Was it for them? Was there a moment where the wife also thought, maybe I too would love a life of pleasure, right? Like I think there are numerous ways that this opera could have resonated with folks in the audience, for better or for worse. But, sitting here in the 21st century, it's laughable, right, to think that this is what freedom looks like. Because thank goodness now we can vote. We have a lot of options available to us in terms of work. And we're not held to these rigid gender roles, right? In the 19th century, women in the US in particular were held to this cult of true womanhood. It was purity, piety, chastity. And so there might have been a little bit more of an allure to the prostitute, because in fact, these stories of prostitution were kind of prolific in that time. But I'll stop there. I want to say, despite the flaws with this opera, I did think it was quite beautiful, and I look forward to seeing it when it's in town. So, Sarah, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the music?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to Toledo Opera for bringing us together, because it's nice to have this conversation with the three of you. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the reason why we're all here today is actually because of the beauty in the music. So it's a juxtaposition between like the terrible plot and like totally unrealistic, like some fantasy of what somebody imagines this life is like, which it's not. With, gorgeous, just set by one of the most brilliant composers. And so I'm kind of thinking that what we need now is the brilliant composers from today to step up, especially women, and write their own stories and write their, achingly beautiful melodies that have to do with motherhood or whatever they want to write about, or like judo, or like space astronauts, or like whatever they want to write about, right? Not just these stories, which we seem to do over and over and over again on the grand opera stage. So it definitely, I guess, contemporary opera has kind of a way out for us. But yeah, I mean, undeniably, it's really beautiful music. Sometimes the music gets us to take in ideas that we might not take in otherwise. So sometimes it's just nice to have a little bit of separation there to think about, what are these ideas that I'm ingesting? So I just want to invite Naomi, if you want to, because you gave this wonderful plot synopsis, which I really appreciated also, because it's been a little while since I conducted this piece. But what's your opinion on the piece,
Well, I wanted to sort of put it out there, because I think too frequently when we think about opera, we only think of the opera plot, and we don't fill in what is the story behind it, sort of what is the novel or the play on which this 19th or 18th century work is based on. And then how does that mirror real life at that time period? And as Dr. Creswell helped us understand, that this really isn't just a made up composite person, but this was actually a real person. And yes, in the chat, somebody said that Marie Duplessis got married, and indeed she did. She had many lovers at the time, but even though she died at 23 from tuberculosis, she was somebody who was able to marry. I don't know anything about sort of if we have any letters or diaries or that type of information, but so we've got this tension between, oh my gosh, we love opera, we love the escape it provides, but it's also a little creepy to think, oh my gosh, what kind of misogynist story am I looking at? I have some friends who say, oh yeah, I really love hip hop, but sometimes the lyrics really freak me out. And I'm like, yeah, I really love opera, and sometimes the stories really freak me out. And I love hip hop, and the lyrics sometimes freak me out. So how do we reconcile this? Well, one thing that helps me is to think of Violetta and to take her sort of seriously as that character in the opera. At the end of Act 1, we see Violetta. One thing I like in Verdi's operas was, rather than just saying, and particularly these operas from the middle period on, I like to see when we have a female character making decisions, where she's sort of taking that power to say, I'm going to decide to do something. So at the end of Act 1, we see her trying to make a decision. The Sempre Libera is, I'm always free, I love anyone. Maybe she thinks there's an empowerment in that, even though it's sort of floating around, and she does, maybe, you know, being grounded is not what she wants at that age. And we also see her saying, wait a minute, you know, I sell my love, or I'm with people because they pay me, but maybe there's another way. Maybe there is, you know, something connected with this Alfredo guy. Then at the beginning of Act 2, we see she makes the decision that we really weren't expecting to think, because the Cabaletta and the Sempre Libera, as we heard, is just so enticing and intoxicating and wonderful. We think, oh, she's going to stay free. The part, though, that really gets me with seeing Violetta make decisions happens in that second act. And it's the part that if you don't know what's going on, it feels kind of boring, or it can, because you have Germont, the father, the baritone, with soprano, the Violetta. And she says, he comes in there and he's basically, you need to leave my son. You are not a good woman. I have a daughter. And we never meet this daughter, but, you know, she's called pure as an angel. She is, you know, the woman who comes from a higher class background, and she's about to get married, but the family she's going to marry into says, your son is sort of hanging around with this messy woman. No. And so Germont comes to make it happen. And it's amazing because Violetta could very easily be like, sorry, yeah. Instead, she says, you are in a house where I am paying for it. I am the mistress of this house. You can't treat me this way. And Germont is like, oh, wow, she has a point. So this is when he sort of says, but you have to leave him. And she says, you really can't tell me what to do. I'm independent here. It's almost as though she's taking that liberty, the freedom from the end of the first act, and she's trying to make it work with the love. However, she gets ensnared by the conventions of the time, because when Germont says, okay, you must think of my pure daughter like an angel, and you are having fun, but it's really at her expense. And then we see a side of Violetta where she's like, maybe it really can't work for me. And I don't want to hurt another one of my female sisters out there. And I don't know her, but if I'm keeping her from the life that I really thought I could have, but I can't have, like, we see her resolve coming down, not because he's beating her down, but because we get to see her compassion, her honesty. So I love that moment in the second act, or it's actually an extended moment where she sort of holds her own and holds her own dignity, and she stands up to somebody. It doesn't work in that context because we've got a misogynistic, or at least a patriarchal system where she doesn't have a leg to stand on in those terms. And so she's like, okay, the way to hold my dignity is to say, I am not going to, you know, I will sacrifice myself. And then what happens in the second half of Act 2, when they meet up at Flora's party, Violetta's with the Baron, and Alfredo sees her, he's gambling, and he does something horrifying. And I want you to really sense this when you're watching it. He's lucky in cards. He says he's unlucky with love. A lot of productions have him drinking, so he's sort of showing, you know, wild abandon. And he then takes the money he wins and he throws it at her, as though he's paying for her in the public, you know, like really reducing her. And this is horrible. And even Germont is saying, okay, yeah, this you've crossed the line, and thinking, and we all know in the audience, yeah, it's your fault she left. She didn't want to leave. So by the end of the opera in Act 3, where she has gone through the worst, but she's held her own, and she doesn't yell at the end of Act 2 saying, it's your dad who made me do this. I mean, this is not a Jerry Springer, not a 21st century moment. She's quiet, but there's incredible, I see it as incredible dignity. So by the end of the opera, she's the one we think of, not just a hooker with a heart of gold, but she's the one who's lived honestly. She's the one who's done sort of what she behaved honorably. She is the most moral one, even when she's forced into all these different things. So that's why I just see, I don't know. How do you guys see her? I'm all team Violetta by the end.
You know, I I love your interpretation, right? I love that you see it, that you see this freedom. I don't necessarily see that, right? I'm not as familiar with opera. I, have all these other things running in the back of my head, but I really appreciate, like, as you're describing this, I'm thinking, yeah, I see that. But I also can't help but wonder, right? What would this story look like if it had been told by a sex worker, right? If it had been told even by a woman of that
Love
time,
that.
one of the sad things about the history of sex workers is that they didn't really leave their own record, right? They were written about by Johns, by police, right? By the courts, by newspaper writers, but never really about them. They never really wrote about themselves. And so, what would it look like if we were to, open up this story for a woman to tell it? And Dr. Creswell, you have, why don't you jump in there? Because you have done this, right?
You've imagined this, yes.
Well, what? Well, I think probably a lot of the people who are tuning in and a lot of people who will attend La Traviata in Toledo are old enough that they will be familiar with a woman named Eileen Wuornos, who in the late 80s and early 90s was a real woman who down in Florida was arrested for killing 7 men. And the movie Monster is about her, the one with Charlize Theron. And her childhood, she is not regarded as a great beauty physically, although we know that in Traviata, the woman that story is based on, she was known for her great physical beauty. Eileen Wuornos was not regarded as beautiful. However, their childhoods were very, very similar, with an alcoholic parent. In Eileen's case, it was her grandfather, because her grandparents raised her. Started receiving material possessions for sexual favors at age 11. Left home for good at age 15. And in her case, she hitchhiked from Troy, Michigan down to Florida, where she settled and continued to live first as a trafficked person, right? Because when you're a minor, you cannot be a prostitute. You are a trafficked person. And then once she was over the age of 18, continued to work as a sex worker and prostitute until her mid-30s. So a long time, until she began killing men that would pick her up off of the highway. So a couple of years ago, my creative partner on this project, Kathleen Kelly, and I decided to tell that story. So we wrote a piece called Interstate. We wrote the libretto and we commissioned Kamala Shankaram to compose the score. So we're dealing with 3 women telling the story. And because of technology, there are many, many hours of interviews and quotes of Eileen Wuornos, because it was a worldwide known story. 60 Minutes did interviews with her. There were people from Australia doing interviews with her. There are podcasts now. Dozens of podcasts all on Eileen Wuornos with her voice recorded. So we have lots of information straight from her mouth. But we decided to create this piece that is fictional and inspired by her life and her friendship with her childhood friend, because we did not want to tell this story involving men and how they felt. This story was not about that. So after a couple of years, we got it on its feet, and Helio Arts and Minnesota Opera produced a movie of it, which you can go to helioarts.com and rent it. You can still see it. It's an opera movie, kind of its own genre, I think. It's developing out of the pandemic. But for me, it was sort of a direct response to La Traviata. And what I would like to say is that the difficult thing, yes, the music is beautiful. We also think it's beautiful because we've been told to think that it's beautiful. I mean, we have been taught, because Verdi is so produced so often, you start out and it's like, oh, here's bel canto and then here's Verdi, and this is how beautiful opera music sounds. Don't you love it? So, I mean, of course, right? The music's beautiful. I also think that's the danger in it. I think that when you can walk out of seeing La Traviata humming Sempre Libera, there's a problem.
I really like this way you're connecting. Sort of, we think of women and beauty and danger, and we
Well,
rarely put, as you were saying, sort of the seductive danger of being lulled into thinking this is okay.
I mean,
yeah,
this is like everything that Wagner wrote, right? He has like gorgeous, gorgeous music, and these are horrible ideas, some of them. I
yeah,
mean, so yeah, the stuff that you're taking in with by the beautiful music. Yeah.
yeah. I also want to talk about, if I may, for just a second, women and sopranos or leading ladies of the stage and the lack of power that exists, but the power that everyone thinks we have. Um,
Say more.
oftentimes, if we talk about women in opera, women in power in the opera industry, people point to leading sopranos as though there was an option to not have us there. It's not a position of power. Women are still not telling most of the stories. We're not composing the pieces. We're not writing the librettos. Most of the source material, if you're using a play or a novel or anything, it's material that a man wrote that you may be adapting. Being on the stage is not a position of power in that sense, in the same way that being the top courtesan in Paris is also not a position of power. You pay dearly for that attention. And I do think that there is a strong tie-in with youth, with physical beauty. Those are the things that get you the attention that might pull you out of a lower socioeconomic class. In classical music and in Paris, it turns out. I'm going to step back.
This theme of dangerous beauty, it keeps coming up.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think is interesting, when I just told friends that I was going to watch an opera, they just kind of had a blank mind, right? They were like, I don't know what to say to that. And so, I wonder about, opera and what it means to 21st century audiences, especially, right, because so much of the material is written at a time when women weren't telling their own stories. People of color, right, weren't telling their own stories. The working class wasn't telling their own story. So could we talk a little bit more, Jennifer, you already started this, but let's talk a little bit more about what it looks like for the subaltern to speak, right? For folks to begin telling those stories in opera today, and how that makes it more accessible.
I'll jump in. Oh, Sarah, jump right in. Oh, okay. I'll say something really quick. One of the things that I have been really excited about doing is to find operas that are from these voices that we don't have. And I love that Spivak, can the people who are oppressed actually, like, how do you talk? Also, I think of Audre Lorde with, do you use the institution, or do you have to dismantle the house using other tools? Do you just sort of do something else? One thing I love about Dr. Creswell's interstate project, and I got to hear some of it as it was moving through, and it's just, but it really does matter whose story is being told by whom. One of the things I'm doing a lot in my work is finding operas written by Black composers that we don't have, so we just assume they're not there. And then the horror as well as the joy the horror that we don't have them, and so we just assume they're not there, but the joy that there are a lot of operas, and we're right in the thick of beginning this. Harry Lawrence Freeman is one of the earliest, who was born in 1868 and had operas that were performed in the 1890s as well, and he lived into the 1940s and was trying to get his works done, and had a really hard time doing that. So there are operas, if we look for them, of different voices coming out, but we don't have enough. And so the question is, what do we do with the operas we have now? There is such, this tension, this friction that we've identified of this incredibly gorgeous, beautiful stuff. If you know the tradition, and it sort of plays into the more you know, the more you can understand. And then, but if you don't know it, and we don't have opera and classical music frequently being taught throughout public schools in the United States and probably beyond, if it feels like an elitist form. Angela, your point about this is, your friends were a little baffled, like, now, why are you going to an opera? What could be there for you? My feeling, because I was in New York City when I was in college, and I stood at the Metropolitan Opera. I had some friends who got me into it. My mother is a singer, so I had that. And so I got converted early, but it's not easy to tell people, yeah, this is great. And so that's why my feeling is I love to talk about and look at operas in traditional places and opera houses, as well as non-traditional places, bringing it to non-music majors, but still college students, community organizations, and teaching opera in prisons. So my feeling is this is goodies, and I want everybody to have some, but it's a steep hill.
And I think what's amazing is kind of what's happening now. I mean, Toledo Opera, I believe, is going to be performing the opera Blue later this season, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's very contemporary and very relevant. And I just feel like, especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic, people did a lot of things online, as Jenny was saying, and so much more variety has come out that people are able to tell their own stories. So I feel like Blue, August 26th and 28th, 2022 with Toledo Opera.
Yes, I'm coming back.
Yeah, a fantastic piece. And I mean, maybe somebody can talk more about it at some point, but just how the contemporary opera is the place now where we can go with all these new things being invented, where people get to tell their own stories more.
And it's great because I like to call it a golden age right now. The summer of 2019, right before the pandemic, we have 3 operas that are really making like this huge splash. Blue by Janine Tesori and Tazewell Thompson is about a middle-class Black family where the father is a policeman, and the first act, it's in 2 acts. You fall in love with this family and they're smart friends, and the mom is having a baby, and they're all excited about this. And then you find out that when the child grows into a teenager between acts 1 and 2, and there's a really thoughtful way of not sensationalizing violence, we find out that the son has been killed by one of the father's white policeman cohort. And so dealing with this from the inside of police violence on a Black family. We have Anthony Davis's opera, The Central Park Five, which is about the exonerated 5 from the summer of 1989, when 5 young Black and Latino young people, the oldest was Corey, who was 16. They were falsely accused, but pressured into admitting that they had raped and brutalized what became known as the Central Park Jogger. I remember this very clearly because I was in college that summer in 1989, and I was in, it happened on the east side on 100 around 110th Street, I think, and I was on the west side at Barnard and the Columbia campus. That opera is the first opera by Black composer to win a Pulitzer Prize, and also Anthony Davis's first opera, X, Life and Times of Malcolm X, is going to be performed in just a few weeks at the Detroit Opera. And then it's going to be a bunch of opera houses have picked it up. Omaha Opera, the Metropolitan Opera, and Seattle Opera. And I think it'll probably go to a few other places. And then the third opera just in that group is Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which was the first opera by a Black composer to be performed at the Metropolitan Opera stage just this past September 27th. I just finally got to see it live as it went to Chicago these past couple of weekends. So there is hope. There's, in addition to interstate and opera projects, and that one is hopefully somebody can put that in the text or in the chat or something. Helios Opera, Interstate by Jennifer Creswell, Kathleen. Oh, I'll let you say it. And Kamala Sankara. You'll get it better than I.
It is in the chat. So if you're interested,
there it is.
Click the link. Yep, and you can go and check it out. It's streaming there for free. So, this is wonderful that there are so many exciting things happening in the world of opera. Kim here says people think it's not accessible until they experience it. And yes, Kim, I agree. So I'm going to be dragging a friend with me to see this one, and I'll go back for Blue, and I might be hooked now. So we're coming up on 7:00, and I want to save some time for Q&A. Does anyone want to share any last thoughts before we open the floor for questions? Go ahead.
Sure. Just really quickly, I hope that people are encouraged, people who don't normally go to the opera, I hope that they are encouraged to come see La Traviata. I do think that it is very possible to take in, these top 5 or top 10 most produced operas, your Verdi and your Wagner and your Mozart and Puccini, and use them as gateways for discussion.
Yeah.
And use them as reference points to see what the possibility can be now. But you can't really build the potential and possibility unless you know where you're coming from. So nail those top 5 operas down, your Traviata, your Aida, your Bohème, your Butterfly. Nail those down, figure out what it is you are drawn to and why you want to see more, and then think about how things could be different now.
Yes.
And I mean, just from the video we saw at the beginning, sorry if my internet's lagging, I don't mean to interrupt, but just, the possibilities of the human voice. I mean, it's incredible. It's amazing. And, it's kind of a huge luxury to basically have a movie acted out live in front of you for the price of a ticket. So that's what opera, with music. It's an amazing opportunity.
So what questions do folks have? Do we want to dig a little bit deeper into the plot? Do we want to explore? There were some comments about the theme of beauty. There's also the conversation about accessibility in the opera. So what are folks thinking?
Well, as people are writing things down, and please do, because even if it's a comment, a question, if something isn't clear, but a theme that sort of come out is this idea of watching opera from the 21st century, hearing stories that are luckily do not reflect all of the opportunities open to us today. I'm not saying that these things have all, that misogyny is gone, that racial injustice, that that these things don't still exist, but we're generally in a better position in a lot of ways. So when we reenact these things, because performing arts, it's different than a picture or a novel where you go and you see it and it's sort of static, or you read it and you interact with it, but you can't change it. Opera, you perform. And Sarah, you conduct it. Jenny, you, sorry, I don't mean to, my illustrious colleagues, you sing it. What is, maybe it's too much to ask, but my question is, I write about it, I see it, and I think about it. What's the resistance? How do you, instead of saying, well, I'm just going to turn off the thinking part of my brain and go and watch it and love it, for me, it's finding these moments for Gilda in Rigoletto or Traviata, where these characters have bad fates, but they make decisions. It's sort of the strength of their interacting and doing something that goes a little against the grain. How does that work for you two?
Thank you for this question. Some of my resistance is like, I'm done conducting Carmen. Thank you. I don't need that anymore, but it's beautiful music. Some of my resistance is to conduct sacred music because I love that. And it's, you know, for me, that's a beautiful solution in a way.
And we're in such a week now with Ramadan, Passover, and Easter all sort of intersecting this weekend.
Yes, and the full moon this weekend. Some of my resistance. So I'm doing a production of Dead Man Walking right now at Opera Idaho, and that's where I am. And as I was studying the score, I mean, I was involved in the premiere 20 years ago, and I remember that quite deeply.
Oh my gosh! Congratulations! Wow.
Oh, I was the prompter and the cover conductor at the premiere. But so we're doing a production now. And as I was studying the piece and going through the prelude, which is where we see the terrible crime committed, you know, there's a moment. The director there's a moment of he called it the victory chord. He just said today, you know, which is, I do not want to see a rape happen on stage and the music is victorious. I'm done with that. Thank you very much. That's over. So, I mean, for me, I just like, I'm tired of that. So the best depiction I ever saw was actually Kamala Sankaram. It was in her thumbprint. And there was no physical violence on stage at all. We didn't see any of that. We didn't participate in any of that. We didn't feel any glorious feelings while we were watching that. We saw people come in and put a knife into a sack of rice, and the rice spilled out. And this was the best depiction of a rape that I had ever seen. This was an honor thing set in, I think it was set in Pakistan. I'm not sure where. Anyway, so the point is, my resistance is that I called the director, or I emailed him or whatever. And I was like, can you do me a favor? See this bar, like bar 8 or whatever. Can you not have the deed and the killing happen right at that moment? Can we not do that this time? And, you know, bless him. He's like, oh yeah, I see exactly what you're talking about. Okay, let's do something different. So we're going to do something different. And he told me what it is today, but I can't remember. We'll be rehearsing it in the next few days. That's my resistance as the person in the pit who actually has to feel what every character feels when they're feeling it. You know, the conductor sings along. Sorry, I'm looking at you, even though it looks like I'm looking. This StreamYard thing is weird. As the person in the pit who has to, you know, sing along and feel all the feelings, because that's how we get the tempo for the music and the color of, you know, the color of the music. So that's one small act of resistance.
That's really powerful. Thank you.
Gosh, I would say that for my resistance, I make the choices where I have the power to make them. So championing women's works, focusing on pieces composed and written by women with the text by the women. Singing is complicated, right? Because many of the newer pieces that are coming out that do tell really important stories tend to be what we call chamber operas, which are smaller productions with smaller orchestration, maybe a string quartet, maybe just a piano. And they tend to be done in smaller houses. When it comes to earning a living as a singer, it's often the larger institutions that supply that. And the larger institutions still make the bulk of their programming off of those top 5 or 10 operas. So resistance is tricky in that regard. I would say that when it comes to putting together song recitals, making the choice to perform exclusively women's works and not making it a huge deal. Just telling that story. One of the things that GDQ Arts does is elevate women's voices. That's the point. So although it's very, very small, we've been able to commission several pieces that have had premieres in Detroit and Cincinnati and virtually as well, reaching out to women and asking them to just write. Tell us the story. And talk about things that are not just about tragedy and women struggling and being punished if they think for themselves. So talk about a mentor that maybe you don't put on your resume because you didn't think they were important enough, even though they were your piano teacher for the first 12 years of your study, or they were the nanny that encouraged you to sing when no one else in your family did, right? So that's a small part of my resistance. As a performer, I'm 41 years old. I am in my vocal prime and I have no desire to play a teenager. Like I'm not interested. I do not want to be the girl that is so beautiful because she's 16 and all of the men are hot for her. That does not interest me. And that's Mimi, that's Musetta, that's Violetta, that's Butterfly. Like, I have no desire. That's not a story I want my name associated with. And yeah, the music's pretty, but guess what? Lots of music can be pretty if you do it well.
That's an excellent point. And I love how both of you really are rewriting the narrative. I'm with you. We need different stories. You know, gosh, I love TV, and anytime a show has rape in it, I'm just like, why? Why? Stop, please stop. So yeah, thank you so much for taking creative license and doing things differently.
Just done with watching that and calling it entertainment or art and paying for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. We've got a comment here from Natty. Telling stories through music is fairly timeless, but as a newer, more diverse audiences engage with the opera, I think they will drive a lot of the changes in the content we see on stage. Absolutely. Absolutely. Kim says, I took my daughter to Butterfly when she was 14 and she was furious at the plot.
As she should be. And I'd like to, if I could, take this opportunity to pass on a comment, because I was talking with some of the other women in the cast. I'm like, yeah, what does Violetta have to say to us in 2022? And, the first response was, tell Germont to go. Get out. But another, someone else said they had been working with a group of young artists. And out of the 5 young artists, 3 of them decided not to choose this as a career because these are like millennial folks. They're not going to put up with this stuff. Like, these power structures have to change in order to, retain people, artists, and not only audience, but people who are interested in participating, playing in the game.
Other folks, let's see, got some time for questions here. Someone else says, millennials aren't, and definitely not Gen Z, not here for the femme fatale or anything that is going to bring the vibrations down, as the young kids would say. So, I want to go back to the question about accessibility, because one of the things that I was thinking about as well is the cost of opera. And Jenny, you had mentioned that sometimes the best shows are at these smaller venues. I know that Toledo Opera here is working on a number of initiatives to get the opera out in the open. Did anyone else want to comment on the class status of opera and the economics behind it, and how do we make it a little bit more accessible?
I'll just jump in here and say one thing I find so smart about many opera companies, not enough, but at least some, and Toledo is really one of the leaders, is having events that bring a lot of different people together. So it's not just people in some sort of ivory tower who know opera and just kind of emote over the beauty of the sound and the wonder of it, but to really focus in on what does trafficking and sex work have to do with Traviata today, and how do we watch it and think about this? Like, what kind of violence are we watching? Are we recreating and aestheticizing with the real character behind the Violetta character? I don't. Uh, I think it's okay to be sober about these things. Traviata, I think, for me personally, and I think other folks will see, not everyone, but some, that there's an incredible beauty to the sound, and there's an incredible sort of um, pulling together themes that go throughout. The very first thing you hear in Traviata are these really trembling, it's a prelude rather than an overture. Verdi calls it a prelude, which he doesn't use that often in his operas. He does for Aida in 71, but this is 53, and he says it's a prelude. It's very short, but very high shimmering strings, which go into this almost ethereal, quasi-celestial sense. And when you're hearing it for the first time, you don't really know what's going on. And then you move into a party. So there's no stop. It goes directly into the party. The opening makes sense because it's a frame for the third act where you get that same sort of delicate sound. And so a lot of people think of it. The third act opens when Violetta is sick and she's dying, and she's reading a note that Alfredo has just found out. So when he shows up at the end of Act 3 with his father, he said, my father told me, I realized, you didn't leave me because you didn't want to, and I'm coming. And so she's sort of holding out for that. But there's this incredible sense of sort of unity that the opera brings. Is she frail? Is there incredible strength up there? Is there a celestial component? Like, we get to pull it together. I don't think there's one narrative in these operas, though there's a dominant narrative. I think it's possible to read counter and resistance narratives in there. For me, knowing the world of opera and I wrote my dissertation on Verdi, so, full disclosure, I love this stuff. And I watched it and learned about it before I put my brain to thinking, wait, what's going on? I just kind of fell in love with the sound. And now I'm like, okay, do I still want to love this stuff? And it's like, yes, actually, there's stuff in here I get to think about. So sort of an answer all over the place, but I love it when we have programming like now that really brings like, what is this? What's happening? And I want the people who know opera really well. I want people who've never been to an opera to be able to sort of hear these themes and talk about it. So hopefully when you give it a chance, you're like, oh, yeah, I don't like this. Or, oh my God, I had no idea. And this is for me. For me, that sort of the class element is the resistance that this can be for everyone.
And there's the sonic accessibility. And I might also just chime in on this question about financial structure. Actually, opera is state funded in Europe, which is, opera was invented in Europe. So for 400 years, there's been guaranteed funding. People could do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to worry about the audience. Actually, you can get into an opera for like $5, in a lot of places in Europe. So when that came to America, the system was different. And this is why it's such an accessibility issue in America with the high price of tickets, because there is basically no state funding. There's sort of a symbolic, like, yes, we approve of you, and, but it's not that much money. So it's mostly from private donors. And this affects the ticket price for sure, because so much of that money has to be recouped through the ticket price. But I must say, Toledo Opera has this amazing program, which I only found out about last week, which is like welcoming all kinds of people that haven't been to the opera before and actually paying them to write their honest response and like a critique to the opera. So that's really cool. And I think there may also be some transportation involved. So I don't know. I think that's amazing. And I hope that we can see more programs like that around the country. I hear a little bit of an echo, so I will end there.
I think that as far as accessibility goes, there are certainly at every university and college, there are operas being put on by students, by undergrads and graduate students, and the ticket prices will be very low consistently, right? Because it's an academic setting and anyone can come in and see those operas. If you're looking for a steady supply, many opera companies, including Toledo and Detroit and most regional companies in this country have student night at the opera, where students are invited, high school students are invited either for an extremely low fee or for free to attend the final dress rehearsal. And so teenagers have access that way. A lot of companies have student rush tickets that are usually $10 to $25, often on a Wednesday night or a Tuesday night or something that where perhaps it would not be an automatic sellout. People can attend that way. And I also think that the majority of opera houses in this country put on like 2 to 4 productions a year, right? So it's not an all the time thing. So if you are exposed, I know that at a much younger level, a lot of companies also go to elementary schools and perform, the Opera on Wheels tour. I wrote 7 productions that Toledo Opera brought to elementary schools, like 20,000 kids a year. So they see them there. They have the opportunity to go in high school. A lot of foreign language classes bring their students to student night at the opera all over. And then after that, if you're not hooked after being exposed, 3, 4, 5 times, then maybe it's not worth it to you. But I do think that for a lot of people, it will be. And if you think about the fact that you're going once or twice a year, it might be something that you want to budget for, save up for, because the special thing about it, it's almost like 2 different art forms, right? Because I'm a big fan of digital. I am, of digital performances and viewing them on a screen. I was born and raised in the Toledo area, and I absolutely had VHS copies of the Pagliacci from the Met from the early 90s with Stratus and from the Bohème that Baz Luhrmann did in Australia. Like I had those VHS videotapes and I loved them dearly. But there is something really special about going live. And that's not something, that feeling of sitting in the theater and taking in that full sensory spectacle is not something that can be recreated. When you're seeing live singers in a live orchestra and everyone's there and underneath the stage and behind the stage, there are hundreds of people working to make the set work and to do your hair and your makeup, and you have wig changes, and it's really crazy actually backstage. I think bringing audience in and letting them see that side of it as well is kind of fun. But I think if you come to appreciate what it is, and then you look at the price of a Broadway musical ticket, which is often double times or more what it is to go to the opera around here. If you look at it from that regard, that it is a handful of times a year, then that's a point of access.
That's an important perspective. Thank you for that. And a couple of people in the chat are saying Toledo Opera offers free tickets to students for one performance. Another person, Lauren, mentioned the View Then Voice program. So there are definitely opportunities here with the Toledo Opera to get involved, to see it for free, and they go out in the community. So, okay, any last questions from the audience? Let's see, we have a comment from Heather about how opera plots show what has been. It's important to know that, but that it must be changed. I hope the narrative that Carmen ruined Don Jose will change into Don Jose was a psychopath. Looks like another opera I must see so that I can love to hate it. Okay, maybe that's a little too strong. All right, so if there are no other questions from folks, panelists, any closing thoughts, last parting shots? Yes, Sarah.
I had two thoughts. One is just actually sort of broadening out this topic of feminism opera in my own mind. So in my own mind, the original woman's issue is Gaia and our relationship to her, the earth as a being. And so sort of thinking, I love it that we're having these conversations about women in opera. And then also just putting it in our minds. So there are conversations happening in Europe about sustainability within the opera industry and within the classical music industry. In Europe, there are orchestras that they don't fly in soloists. They actually put them on trains. Of course, they have a functional train system in Europe, so that's pretty easy. There are opera companies that have a garden on the roof with bees, and they sell honey in the opera shop. And there's a company that's working on doing a carbon neutral ring cycle. And they're like starting small with one opera, and then they're hoping to do a ring. So like there are people thinking about these things. I hope that we can begin the conversation in America. There's also like the Sydney Opera House, which is going beyond it. It went carbon neutral 5 years before planned, before projected. And then, but they're actually regenerative. Like they're like making coral reefs in their, like in the part underneath the opera house. So like these conversations are happening, and it would be great to bring these conversations to America. That's one thought. Just restoring our relationship to Gaia. And then for friends in Toledo, recently, this is off the topic of this panel for a moment, but just as Char Robinson was remembered in the beginning of sort of dedication to her, that she had passed. I only recently learned that Dave Beckwith had passed a few weeks ago. And so to friends in Toledo, just to remember him, that I just so much appreciated his kindness when I moved to Toledo. He took me out to the local coffee shop and we had brunch, and he told me everything I needed to know and everything about, his political organizing. And I'm just remembering him fondly. He was a dedicated board member as well as singer in the chorus for Toledo Opera, and a lovely, generous man. And so I just wanted to remember him fondly to everybody. Yeah. And I'm sure that he's up there singing right now with the angels. Like, I'm sure they're having a good time, and he's singing. So.
I think my final thoughts would be that two things, one plea to audiences and one to companies that produce operas. The first to the audience is, I hope that people can be thoughtful and have conversations amongst themselves about what they have seen and are not content to just be entertained at the suffering and death of women, which is the vast majority of operas. I hope that they can take a few minutes to think about what they witnessed to really beautiful music and think about how that plays into it today. I know that period pieces and operas that are not done in American English, if they're done in Italian or French or German or whatever, I hope that people don't let that distance of a different language or a different time period take away from what is actually happening on stage between the characters. And I hope people just have discussions about it. Beyond that, I hope that anyone who financially supports an institution that produces operas can make their voice heard and request that stories that are going to focus on women are told and written by women. Make sure that stage directors are women. Make sure that whatever is happening, whoever's going to tell the story, let that be the voice that tells the story. It is not enough to hire women to sing the roles that women were written to sing, right? Like that the pieces were written for women to sing. That's not power, and that's not highlighting and giving women power in opera. It is in the conducting, it is in the orchestra, it is in everything that goes into producing an opera. So if you are supporting a local opera institution or you work for an opera institution in administration, make sure that women are actually focused in these stories where all of the women die. That's what I'd say. Thanks.
And it's about having women as general directors and general managers who choose the repertoire.
And women on the board, and women whose voices are writing about and talking about and representing these works. I want to say that I so appreciate my colleagues here. This has been a very powerful and wonderful conversation to be a part of. My closing point for thinking about opera, and I really love these ideas. Thank you so much, Sarah, for talking about sustainability. That, to me, that seems like it's brand new in the opera world here in the United States, and I want these models to come out. And Dr. Creswell, thank you so much for talking about the importance of our voices and who we are. I want to say that for opera, there is something very special. This is picking up on a theme in these last few moments that we talked about not too long ago. The live experience in the opera house is unlike a lot of live experiences that we have now, where digital media is happening, lights are flashing. It's rare for us, particularly as we are in this endemic stage of, we're moving from the pandemic into the endemic, to be together in person. And there's a sort of, and I'll use this term intentionally, a very spiritual element of being around other people, being quiet and focusing on something, and having the freedom to think of whatever the thoughts are that you want, but all sort of being focused and receiving what people are giving you in the orchestra pit, on the stage, behind the scene. There's an intense element of, we bring our humanness to take what is being presented and do with it as what we want. We don't have these quiet, darkened spaces to be together. And it's something that I've missed so much over these past few years, and something that I hope we always have, because it's a sort of a collective solidarity where we can be individual and our specific selves in a trying not to use the word universal, but this sort of pulling together to have this, where this is an art form that is meant to be thought about, meant to be championed and resisted, but it's meant to have us there together. We learn how to be more human in these spaces. And so I hope that people continue to do this. It's important for us to go. It's a sacred space for me. And I just want other people to be able to use it that way too. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. And thank you for letting me be part of this. New to the world of opera, and definitely intrigued and looking forward to being part of it some more.
Thank you for moderating us.
Yes, happy to. I'm going to turn the mic back over to Dr. Greenberg so she can close us out. And thank you to everyone who showed up tonight too. This has been wonderful. Thank you for your comments.
Wow, that was incredible. I'm absolutely speechless. I do want to add to this conversation that Toledo Opera is one of the few arts and culture organizations in town that has a woman executive director. And, that is a huge, huge deal. So very, very excited about that. And it means a lot to work for a strong woman like Suzanne G. Rorick. So thank you so much to everyone joining us tonight online, everyone commenting, and to our incredible presenters, Dr. Naomi Andre, Dr. Jennifer Cresswell, Sarah Dobin, and Dr. Angela Fitzpatrick. And a huge thank you to Stephanie Elton, who produced this live stream behind the scenes, ensuring everything ran smoothly. The recording of tonight's panel will be available online soon on Facebook, YouTube, and ToledoOpera.org. To learn more about our other upcoming events, please follow Toledo Opera on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. To sign up for our monthly newsletter, click on ToledoOpera.org and scroll to the bottom of the page. If you enjoyed this virtual event and would like to share your feedback with Toledo Opera, please email me at agreenberg@ToledoOpera.org. If you didn't RSVP for this event but would like to complete our post-event survey tomorrow morning, please email Luke Serrano at lserrano@toledoopera.org or follow the link to the survey in the chat. If you'd like to order tickets for Traviata, please call our box office during business hours at 419-255-SING or order tickets online at toledoopera.org. Thank you all so much again to all our panelists and everyone tuning in online. And to end our evening, we're going to do another round of the performance by soprano Catherine Lewick of Sempre, Libera. Thank you all so much and have a beautiful Tuesday evening.
Thank you.
terra